Robert Ferris. He's the arts editor at the Austin Chronicle, and he is going to speak on Austin's creative community for the 21st century. Robert.
I'd like to echo Libby and say how thrilled I am to be here, and as someone who's been on the scene in Austin for quite a long time and worked closely with a lot of the creative companies in town, I've seen firsthand how Impact Austin grants have changed the way companies have been able to serve the city. So thank you so much for that, and I look forward. I hope I have something to say that's of interest and relevance to you this morning. So you can't be in Austin for very long without hearing about the Armadillo World Headquarters, right? That legendary venue with the grandiose name was a cultural hub. We'll make that countercultural hub throughout the 70s. A venue that played host to as eclectic an array of acts as the city had seen up to that time. Rock, blues, country, reggae, jazz, comedy, punk, folk, hell, even the ballet. I say this not to indulge in nostalgic narcissism about how much cooler Austin was way back when, as time-honored a tradition as that is in our town, but to offer a seminal example of an expansiveness of identity that's long influenced Austin's creative scene. One of the great legacies of the Armadillo was as how it served as a crossroads for the country and rock scenes. At a time when long hair and pot could get you a serious whooping in a lot of places in Texas, the Dillo was a spot where you could be a cowboy and a hippie. And when the two fused, as with the scene's most renowned and proudest outlaw, artist Willie Nelson, something fresh came into the world and flourished. The thing about the Dillo is that it was an open space. It gave people enough room to break free of traditional roles and embrace multiple identities. The cultural history of Austin is littered with such spaces, less well known than the Dillo perhaps, but driven by the same impulse toward openness. Take Hyde Park Theater, for instance, a repurposed neighborhood post office with a postage stamp stage. In the early 90s, it became home to Frontera Fest, a non-jury performance festival where anyone could pay a small fee and have 25 minutes of stage time to do whatever they wanted, no restrictions. From the outset, Frontera Fest became a research and development lab for artists aching to try something new. Actors writing plays, playwrights writing poetry, poets dancing, dancers acting. Even people who had never set foot on a stage felt they had a safe place in which to make a theatrical statement. The festival thrived, and not only with artists, audiences filled up the 80-seat theater night after night, year after year. No one gave two hoots about whether an actor had the right to write a play or a dancer to speak. They were totally accepting of the artist who was creative in more than one way. Go ahead and experiment, they said. We'll support you. Now, they've kept it up at Frontera Fest for 20 years, a kind of longevity that is worthy of a fist bump, but it's also indicative of how Austin has institutionalized a way of saying yes to people seeking to expand their creative identities. My longtime colleague, Michael Barnes, who covers the community from a social perspective, has called Austin an open city, and that feels right. There's an openness to change, to new people, to new ideas, to new ways of doing things. And because so many traditional barriers between people, groups, or methodologies either don't exist or are ignored, there's an openness of movement that makes it all the easier for someone to range all over the place, to seek out the horizon, and for others to strike out for it alongside him or to follow his trail. That's how Tom Jones and Harvey Schmidt, the musical theater team behind the Fantastics, came together. Both had grown up in little Texas towns that had little use for theater, and they spent most of their early years as lonely outsiders. But because the big state university was in Austin, this was where they came to school, and once here, they discovered they weren't alone in their love for the stage. The city was a magnet for all the drama queens and geeks stranded in tiny towns across the Lone Star State, and it offered them a space where they could pursue their theatrical dreams together. Jones and Schmidt found in each other the perfect partner for making musical theater, and they went on to build an extraordinary career as a team. See, Austin is a relatively easy place in which to find creative collaborators. Few arts companies operate as closed shops or isolate themselves from the rest of the community. Consequently, artists are free to find other artists with whom they're simpatico, to work together on individual projects, or to form long-term collectives. And whether it's a small-town neighborliness left over from the city's long stint as a sleepy college town, or that laid-back hippie ethos that took root in the Dillo days, or, as some of Austin's detractors claim, a simple lack of ambition in the slackers who based here, local artists of like mind would rather cooperate than compete. Get two or more of these unbound by boundaries types on a deck, and they're liable to start bouncing crazy what-ifs off each other, especially if there are long necks or other mood-enhancing substances handy. And before you know it, boom, something you hadn't thought possible materializes. The more open the environment, the easier it is to explore. The easier it is to explore, the easier it is to find collaborators. The easier it is to collaborate, the easier it is to experiment and innovate. When openness is as deeply embedded in the culture as it is in Austin, creativity and innovation come much more naturally. They're as much a part of the landscape and as profuse as bluebonnets in April. What we see now in Austin's creative community in the 21st century are 21st century echoes of the Dillo, fusions where you can have a work of art that's dance and theater and visual art and food and music and architecture. With the Fusebox Festival, an annual celebration of experimental work, such mashing up of mediums is prized. Projects and productions are curated from around the country and outside it, but work that's made in Austin figures heavily at the festival, not because of hometown boosterism, but because a significant part of the local scene is always relentlessly playing with form and content, mixing this medium and that in the Erlenmeyer flask of performance and seeing if it fizzles or explodes. Back on the 40 acres in the same department where Jones and Schmidt found each other, students are being encouraged to generate their own groundbreaking work and given an institutional platform to do it. During the David Mark Cohen New Works Festival every other spring, classes stop for 5 days so students can present original plays, dances, design installations, and works that mash them together in theaters, outside theaters, under theaters, wherever. Pretty much anything goes, and the creators need not even be restricted to their theatrical area of focus. Venturing into unexplored territories is encouraged, and the blurring of disciplinary boundaries is as much the rule as the exception. In Austin, that blurring of boundaries extends to the people viewing the art as well as those making it. For its play, The Girl with Time in Her Eyes, the Hidden Room Theater invited audiences to use their smartphones to scan QR codes that would lead them to text messages, websites, and even a voicemail message that provided clues to the play's mystery. Clues that excited audience members couldn't resist sharing with one another. Now, this followed another Hidden Room production, one that took place with the British company Look Left, in which audiences in Austin and audiences in London simultaneously took part in a play about a long-distance romance via a Skype connection. That show demonstrated vividly how theater need no longer be split between those on the stage and those in the house, but also how theater no longer be restricted to a single space at all. A performance could truly be global. In our current innovative state, the hyphenate, those actor-dancers, playwright-directors, singer, chefs, the hyphenates rule the day, and the very word artist seems insufficient to describe the type of cultural fusionistas that work here. Robert Lynch, President and CEO of Americans for the Arts, a national advocacy group, in a speech on cultural tourism that he delivered here last year, related an anecdote about meeting a couple of folks in an airport in Austin came up. Oh, we love Austin, they told him. Great, he said. When you're there, do you ever do anything related to the arts? No, they replied, we never do the arts because we're too busy doing music. Okay, we know what those people meant, but it points to this divide that persists between anything artistic in popular culture and what are called the traditional fine art disciplines, as if those sounds being cranked out at clubs and concert halls every night couldn't be part of the arts. Which is why, during the development of the Create Austin Cultural Master Plan a few years ago, advocates for arts and culture adopted the word creative as a surrogate for artist. After 30 years of culture wars in which the arts have been demonized as elitist and offensive, artist is too charged a term to be used effectively in most public discourse. Creative as a noun, and I'm sorry, language cops, I gotta break the law on this one, not only dispenses with all that baggage, it's more reflective of our contemporary attitude toward who's engaged in artistic pursuits. It encompasses filmmakers, designers, craftspeople, chefs, knitters, mixologists, architects, slam poets, programmers, and yes, singer-songwriters, as well as painters, dancers, and classical musicians. What all these very different kinds of people do is creative, and these days they're much more likely to do it with one another, collaborating across discipline and form than the artists of days past. Now, all this creativity isn't just good for the soul or for the state of the art. We've learned that it has a profound impact on students in school. Following up on Libby, nationally, studies show that when students are enrolled in advanced level arts classes, their attendance is higher, their critical thinking is more advanced, and they're more likely to graduate and go to college. The local arts education organization MindPop has tracked test scores for middle school and high school students in AISD and found those in arts classes significantly outperformed their peers of similar cultural backgrounds and comparison areas in all academic areas. 12% in reading skills, 17% in science and math. When you consider the efforts of such groups as Creative Action, which is featured on the cover of this week's Austin Chronicle, which engages some 20,000 area youth in arts and cultural activities annually, and MindPop, which led the way in getting Austin into the Kennedy Center's Any Given Child program, and it's working to include the arts as an instructional strategy in all classes across the curricula. We're poised to develop a generation of Austinites that's better educated, more skilled, and thinks more creatively than any before. The effect on the economy is equally profound. A TXP study in 2012 showed that Austin's creative industries collectively generate $4.35 billion in economic activity and more than $71 million in city tax revenues, and are responsible for almost 49,000 jobs created. What's more, employment in that one sector increased by about 25 years during the 5 years prior to the study. That's during the recession and the recovery from the recession, and it's a good 15% greater than the growth in employment for the local economy overall. Obviously, the growth of events such as South by Southwest, ACL, and the numerous festivals that crowd the calendar these days are proof of that. But that burgeoning creativity can also be seen in our homegrown fashion industry, turning out locally designed clothing. Every tech studio working up a new video game or app. The plethora of films and television programs shot here. The clubs, concert halls, and other venues showcasing live music, and all those food trucks. Many of them experimenting with new flavors to tickle our palates. So if all that's happening, more creatives are diversifying and collaborating and getting work, and more students and audiences are engaged in creative activities, shouldn't we be popping the champagne? Well, there's certainly cause for that, but we might not want to raise our glass just yet, because there's cause for concern as well. Austin's phenomenal growth is also crowding out the creatives who made this such an attractive place to move to in the first place. We all know that wages have not kept pace with the cost of living, and in Austin that means that many of the creatives who were never among the city's top earners to begin with, as Rich's slide showed us earlier, are losing their purchasing power, their ability to pay their taxes, and in some cases their homes. Central city neighborhoods that were for generations among the most affordable in town are gentrifying at an alarming rate, and many creatives are being forced to relocate to the far edges of Austin or leave the city altogether. And areas where creatives have in the past found vacant or abandoned facilities and reworked them into art studios or theaters or galleries are now being developed for strictly high-end residential and retail. Affordability is an issue for all Austinites, but it's an area in which creatives are among the most vulnerable. And when they're forced out of town, they take their cultural contributions with them. That's front page news. Quite literally, if you looked at the Statesman this morning, Jean-Claire Van Ryzen had a story based on the East Austin studio tour happening this weekend that showed, that talked in depth about creatives losing affordability and how it's affecting the future of the creative community in Austin. The greatest success stories of Austin creatives show they don't need much. Two out-of-work actors turn the impressions they do of their relatives into a play about small-town Texas, playing all of the parts themselves. And out of that simple show, Greater Tuna grows one of the most successful franchises in the history of the American theater. A young filmmaker shoots a string of quirky characters walking and talking on Austin streets, and that movie, Slacker, almost single-handedly sets a new course for independent cinema in the United States. A trio of disenfranchised visual artists decide to open up their homes and studios for a weekend to see if they can connect more people with their artwork. And a decade later, the East Austin Studio Tour is the biggest art event in the city, with more than 400 participating artists and venues. Austin creatives have always been able to make wonders out of next to nothing. The danger now is that the increasingly expansive and expensive Austin will leave them nothing to reform, refashion, reinvent. It's essentially closing down the creative part of this open city. Remember the Dillo. Here was a dilapidated old building that no one had any use for until a couple of hippies saw potential in it and had the inspiration and drive to create a cultural open space out of it. And their creation had such an enormous impact that people are still grieving its loss 3 decades later. But without that armory, that cheap, unwanted space, there would have been nothing for them to apply their creativity to, and that space and all the outlaw innovation that went with it would have been lost. The challenge for us as a city is to carve out space in which these musicians and craftspeople and actors and designers and dancers and the like can afford to stay here and have spaces where they can work their magic. If they go, we lose alive what made Austin, Austin. Thank you. I don't want to take away from your break time, but I'm happy to take any questions if you have any. Yes?
I'd love to hear the example. You mentioned at the beginning how you've seen firsthand how we impacted an arts organization. Could you just give us one example?
Sure. The Rude Mex. I don't know if you know, this is a collective of Austin theater artists who formed a group together in the mid-90s. Amazingly, the 6 people who formed the company together are all still speaking together, and they're actually all still the same co-producing artistic directors. They asked for funding for a project called Girl Action, G-R-R-R-L Action. They wanted to create a space, a literal space where they could bring high school teenage girls together to write their own stories, essentially. So giving them a creative voice for their work. And so they built what they call the Offshoot, which is next to their home space, the Off Center. And that's a space that's made a huge difference in hundreds of girls. I think it's been close to 10 years that they've had that space now. Yes?
So I think there's an example in New York of public housing designed specifically for artists, and it's kept the rates at affordable rates. People have lived in apartments for years. Is there any project like that envisioned for Austin where there's a housing development for creative people?
There have been a couple of attempts at that. The basic problem is they move at the glacial pace that so many projects in Austin move at. There is a wonderful Minneapolis-based entity called ArtSpace that has created those kinds of housing projects across the country. And in fact, they've wanted to create a project in Austin for years. They've been collaborating with Austin Playhouse, which has been trying to establish a new theater in the Miller development. They started, I think, talking about it 5 years ago, and they are still, it's a multi-million-dollar project, and there simply isn't a lot of the patronage and infrastructure to make it happen much more quickly. The Fusebox Festival folks are also involved in a housing project that's also referred to in Jean Clair's front page story in The Statesman. There is on the old tank farm that was decommissioned several years ago, I think in the 90s. There's a new development that's springing up, and Fusebox has been brought in as part of the planning team to help make sure that there is space for housing and creative space in that project. But again, that's a multi-year project, and when you only have one that's happening every few years, just look at how much the Austin skyline has changed in that time.
Great. Thank you so much, Robert.